Interventions for classroom disruption, addressing emotional and behavioral problems in the classroom. In the first module, we discussed general issues of classroom management and presented a framework for classroom behavior management. This framework included 3 levels: primary or universal strategies applied to all students, secondary or selected strategies for students at risk for disruption, and tertiary or intensive strategies for students already engaging in disruptive behavior. The most challenging discipline and classroom management issue faced by teachers is severely disruptive behavior. In this module, we will focus on interventions directed at students with emotional and behavioral problems in the classroom. There are 3 goals to this module. First, we will discuss what we know about the types of students who are more likely to engage in challenging behavior in the classroom. Achieving greater understanding about these students can help guide us in selecting the approaches we should or should not take in responding to their behavior. Second, we will work through a 5-step outline for intervening with students who have emotional and behavioral problems. It is important to understand that dealing with challenging behavior is not simply a matter of applying preconceived recipes to classroom behavior. Each student and situation we face in the classroom is unique. In order to cope effectively with challenging behavior, we need to understand the context of the behavior we are dealing with. This model for approaching challenging behavior is based on functional behavioral assessment, or FBA. By attempting to understand the causes of disruptive behavior before implementing an intervention, we vastly increase our chances of success. The third goal of the module will be to provide some specific strategies for working with emotionally and behaviorally challenged students. We will discuss interventions designed for specific setting events or reasons that inspire or maintain disruptive behavior. By linking an intervention to what we know about a student, the intervention is more tailored to the student's needs and specific situation, thereby increasing our chances of successfully addressing the behavior. Who are the students more likely to disrupt classrooms? What do we know about what causes them to act out in school? Social learning theorist Walter Mischel argued that most of us have a very developed sense of how unstated social rules vary from situation to situation and can make the necessary and subtle shifts to match our behavior to those changes. This ability to modify our behavior depending on changing social demands is an essential feature of adaptive or normal social behavior. Most students come to school able to recognize teacher expectations and succeed in adapting their behavior to fit the classroom. For students who exhibit behavior problems, however, being aware of and adapting one's behavior is more difficult. Mischel argues that the maladaptive individual is behaving in accord with expectancies that do not adequately represent the actual behavior outcome rules in his current life situation. That is, students who act out in our classrooms most likely come in with perceptions and beliefs from previous experiences that leave them less able to recognize and adapt their behavior to the spoken and unspoken rules of schools and classrooms. Our knowledge of how conduct and behavior disorders develop can give us some insight into what drives disruptive behavior. This knowledge about the source of a student's disruptive behavior also provides information about how teachers can deal with it. First, we know from the work of Gerald Patterson and his associates that children who display non-compliant, aggressive, or antisocial behavior are often the victims of coercive interactions at home. Patterson describes the classic coercive cycle in which a request from an adult is met with refusal by the child, resulting in a mutually escalating interaction. Whoever gets the other to back down first essentially wins. In the long term, children engaged in these interactions learn that the way to control a situation is to resist. and they bring this understanding with them into the classroom situation. Students who have experienced coercive family cycles may view a teacher's request for compliance as the beginning of a long battle that, to win, they must resist as quickly and firmly as possible. As one child, quoted about detention and the reaction of her teacher, said, "I figure if I'm going to get in trouble, I'm going to annoy him as much as I can. I'm already going to get in trouble. He deserves it if he's going to keep singling me out, so I get on his nerves. If you know you're already in trouble, why shut up?" The clear implication in addressing such confrontational behavior is to avoid the power battles and emotional reactions that play into a child's habitual patterns of engaging adults in such struggles. Another source of disruptive or disordered behavior is the chaotic or unmonitored situation in families with depressed caregivers. In those families, children may face high levels of inconsistency. They may be ignored in some situations and severely punished in other circumstances for exhibiting the same behavior. In the face of such extreme inconsistency, some children may learn that the way to understand limits is to act out, even if it means exposing themselves to harsh punishment. Consequently, when placed in unstructured classroom situations, children from inconsistent home environments may engage in acting out behavior simply to establish limits in that situation. Thus, as teachers, we need to establish a consistent response when implementing rules and procedures, and to refer to those rules during the response. For example, a teacher interested in reducing out-of-seat behavior of a student who randomly wanders around the room should remind the student every time he gets up that he should be in his seat. Moreover, the reminder should be framed not as a nag, "Stephen, get back to your seat," but rather as a reminder of the classroom rules. "Stephen, do you remember what our class rules say about being in your seat?" In this way, disruptive students may learn over time that the classroom environment is not chaotic or random, but rather consistent and stable, and that they do not need to act out to learn what the rules are. Third, perhaps as a result of unsafe or threatening home or community conditions, students who display disruptive behavior may have a skill set that predisposes them to aggression. That is, while most of us, in an ambiguous social situation, will wait and watch, students with this skill set believe that it is wisest to strike out first in order to avoid being the victim of others. In schools or classrooms where we admonish such children to get along, they may show that where they come from, this is how one survives and gets along. We know that emotional reactions to interactions with others tend to escalate. We also know that the answer to children's inconsistent experiences with structure and support is to provide stable and consistent expectations. It is not sufficient to punish maladaptive social behavior. If students have no concept of which behavior is considered appropriate, they will simply replace one negative behavior with another. Thus, we need to engage in the notion of a fair pair. If we seek to reduce a negative behavior, we also have to provide positive alternatives to help students learn constructive, more adaptive behaviors. We know that there is a strong link between antisocial behavior and poor academic achievement, especially in reading and language. So, as the difficulty of academic material increases, students with behavior problems will turn to off-task and disruptive behavior in order to escape from academic demands. Over time, students who have difficulty with academic material may turn off to all schoolwork, regardless of whether it is on their level or not. This phenomenon is known as learned helplessness. Thus, some students may seek to escape from work that they perceive as too difficult, and students with a long history of academic failure may engage in disruptive behavior in order to avoid being labeled as slow or dumb by their teacher or peers. For any student exhibiting problematic behavior in the classroom, it is important to understand the big picture. Is this student trying to escape from or cover up academic failure? Is he trying to establish limits in an unstructured environment? Or is he using the only strategy he knows to win a confrontation? In summary, most of us adapt our behavior to fit the social situation we are in. This may well be the hallmark of normal social behavior. Because of their experiences, however, disruptive students carry behaviors that may be adaptive for them in other settings, but definitely do not help them in school settings. It is almost as if they are wearing a set of cloudy glasses that distort their understanding of school expectations. Michelle suggests that in order for changes in rules and expectations to affect behavior substantially, the person must recognize them. Disruptive students fail to recognize typical expectations in schools and classrooms, and hence they act inappropriately. It is up to us as teachers to instruct them in those expectations. Several years ago, the first author of this module was a presenter on a statewide teleconference of best practices in managing disruptive behavior in the classroom. When we were finished, we opened the phone lines for questions, and the first one we received was this: "All of these procedures you describe are well and good, but what do you do if a kid throws a chair?" The answer Dr. Skiba gave, almost without thinking, was, "Duck!" It was actually the right answer. When a child engages in high-level disruptive or violent behavior, our options are extremely limited. We have a responsibility, first and foremost, to protect the safety of children in our classroom, as well as our own safety. One of the most important messages in this module is this: the earlier we can assess the situation leading to disruptive behavior, the more options we have in addressing the behavior. The earlier we intervene based on careful analysis of patterns of behavior, the less likely it is that we will need to dodge a thrown chair. The remainder of this module is about expanding a teacher's toolbox for addressing disruptive behavior. First, we teach disruptive students new behaviors by accentuating positive strategies and interventions. Second, we use functional assessment to understand the context of behavior. Then we use that understanding to provide a guide for finding and implementing effective interventions. Fourth, rather than simply reacting in the moment to disruptive behavior, we use what we have learned about the behavior to develop a comprehensive plan for preventing and addressing the behavior. And finally, we evaluate our success in addressing the disruptive behavior and, when necessary, make changes to become more effective in our efforts. We begin by considering the importance of accentuating positive strategies in order to teach new behaviors. Patterson and his associates at the Oregon Social Learning Institute have studied students who engage in aggressive or disruptive behavior for almost 40 years. Among their findings about rates of disruption are A. All children sometimes engage in what might be viewed as disruption or noncompliance. B. Children identified as having emotional or behavioral disorders engage in higher rates of those behaviors. And C. Even the children who are identified as having behavioral disorders do not constantly engage in disruptive behavior. Colvin identified 7 phases of disruptive behavior. The first phase, aptly named calm. The important implication of this first phase is that all children, no matter how disruptive, have periods of time in which they are not acting out. We can take advantage of these periods in order to establish a relationship with the child, reward appropriate behaviors, and teach new, more appropriate alternatives. Applying positive consequence to increase appropriate student behavior is catching them being good. It is fairly natural, and indeed important, for us to catch negative behavior early in order to intervene effectively. But most of us miss opportunities to catch positive behavior and gradually shape it into more appropriate behavior. Research has found that rates of positive statements are very low in most classrooms, and in some cases almost non-existent at the high school level. Many disruptive students have little idea of what they are supposed to be doing. Providing specific and positive comments that tell students exactly what they are doing right, or feedback on behaviors they need to modify, may be a novel experience for a child who has not received much praise in his or her life. The idea of successive approximation means that students who are disruptive will not become angels overnight. But we may choose to accept less than perfect behavior if that behavior is progressing towards what we want. Thus, if we have a child who jumps out of her seat every time she doesn't understand an assignment, it is likely too much to expect 100% accurate work from her and us. At first, we might accept that she is allowed to remain in her seat during work periods even if she doesn't complete her work. Then, we might accept that she finishes half of her work, whether accurate or not. Over time, we begin to demand a higher standard of both completion and accuracy. Through this gradual process, we avoid power struggles while steadily shaping the student's behavior toward what we want to see. Such procedures have been shown to be effective with students in general, but are also an important part of culturally competent classroom management. Classroom observation has shown again and again that the most effective teachers in urban settings are those who have been called warm demanders. That is, those teachers do not hesitate to set high expectations for all students, and they also provide a high degree of warmth and support for all individuals in their classroom. In this way, effective teachers send the message, "I expect great things from you, and I care about you as a person, and I will help you to achieve to the level of my high expectations." The second step in expanding our options for dealing with disruptive behavior is to understand the context of behavior. What causes children to behave disruptively in certain situations? Disruptive behavior in the classroom is certainly frustrating. A student who continues to engage in disruption and aggression despite our best efforts makes us ask, why is he or she doing this? Fortunately, we now have the technology of functional behavioral assessment that is specifically intended to answer that question. There are 4 phases in a typical functional behavioral assessment. 1. Describing the behavior. 2. Developing hypotheses for why the behavior occurs. 3. Identifying behaviors that can replace the inappropriate behavior. And 4. Developing a plan to teach those replacement behaviors. In this module, we will not go through all of the procedures involved in functional assessment extensively. Most likely, a classroom consultant, such as your school psychologist, will collect FBA data and work with you in that process. There is also some more description of the FBA process in Part 1 of the APA Classroom Management module. In this part, we will briefly describe some of the early phases of FBA and will focus more on the later phases in order to show how a better understanding of a student's behavior can help us select effective interventions. In the first phase of functional assessment, a school psychologist or other educational professional will work with you to define precisely the behavior about which you are concerned. Through a combination of surveys or checklists, classroom observations, and an interview with you, the assessor will work with you to specify exactly what the behavior looks like. How often does it occur? For how long and with what intensity? Also, the assessor will want to know where the behavior occurs, in which classroom settings, or in response to what kind of work. Once we have a better understanding of the behavior and the conditions under which the behavior happens, we move on to the next phase of functional assessment, in which we develop hypotheses about why this behavior occurs. The why is usually derived from three sources. 1. Setting events, which are the events or situations that lead to the behavior. 2. A need or purpose that is being served by the behavior. And 3. A lack of academic or social skills on the part of the student. Our first task in understanding the behavior we have described is to identify the setting events that may be associated with the behavior. Setting events are those events or situations that set the stage for the behavior and trigger the behavior on a regular basis. We might think of these setting events in two categories. First, immediate setting events, or those that occur immediately before the behavior. These might include the time or period of the day in which the behavior is more likely to occur, any particular subject or task or working arrangements. For example, is it more likely to occur during a presentation, small group work, individual work, or in response to a type or pace of instruction? A second category of setting events that also sets the stage for disruption is external to the classroom. Lack of breakfast, fights at home, or victimization on a school bus are all examples of setting events that may cause children to bring their problems with them and act out in the classroom. Another possible source for disruptive behavior is the function the behavior is serving or the need it meets for the student. Rick Neal and Kay Cessna have identified a number of reasons why students may engage in behavior that disrupts the classroom. The student may be seeking attention from the teacher or other students. For some, even negative attention in the form of reprimands is better than no attention at all. Some students act out in order to escape from work they perceive as too hard for them to complete. Notice that this may not mean that the student is incapable of doing the work. Some students have failed at academic tasks for so long that they have reached a point of learned helplessness. That is, no matter what level of work we give them, they have learned that they cannot do it and will not try. For students who feel they have no control due to chaotic backgrounds, severely disruptive behavior that brings a lesson to a halt and forces everyone in the class to focus on them is a sure way to have some power and control over a situation. Much disordered or aggressive social behavior seems odd or severely inappropriate when viewed from the outside. However, if the child has not learned appropriate social skills, these behaviors may simply be an attempt on the child's part to achieve acceptance or affirmation from others, no matter how unsuccessful the behavior may seem to us. Neal and Cessna note that although we all have reasons that drive our behavior, most of us have learned socially acceptable ways to do so. For example, if in working through this module, you find some material too difficult to understand, you might well decide it's time to go to the kitchen for a snack, which could be classified as an escape function. In implementing our interventions in the classroom, we are not seeking to deny or change the child's need for attention, escape, or control. Instead, we need to teach them appropriate ways of fulfilling these needs. Finally, disruptive behavior may be the result of a lack of skill in certain areas. The student may have academic or other deficits. Some students engage in disruption in order to avoid schoolwork they cannot do. So with these students, it is absolutely necessary to address their academic skills. Otherwise, it is almost certain that no matter how often or hard we intervene, they will continue to try to escape from their academic responsibilities. Other students may have attention difficulties or a deficit in social skills. It is important for us to understand any such lack of skills, as they help us in planning our intervention. In the third phase of functional assessment, we specify an alternative behavior that we wish the student to engage in, the replacement behavior. This behavior more appropriately meets the need of the student or reduces the need for the inappropriate behavior. If, for example, we find that a student is shouting, "I can't do this," because she is seeking and receiving teacher attention, asking the student to look up an answer in the book will not cause her to abandon her misbehavior, even if she is perfectly capable of looking up the answer. Rather, a replacement behavior must provide the student with a more appropriate and acceptable way to get attention from the teacher. For example, a nonverbal cue, like a colored card, can signal to the teacher that a student does not understand something. It is important to understand that the replacement behavior we choose must meet both the student and teacher's needs. As noted, the plan must address the function of the behavior, but also be acceptable in the classroom. Although we might find that never assigning seat work reduces our students' frequency of calling out, "I can't do this," such an intervention would obviously not be acceptable to most teachers, nor would this plan help the student progress academically. Once we can describe the behavior precisely, understand better where it comes from, and specify an alternative behavior that can meet both the students' and teachers' needs, we are ready to find and implement effective strategies that address the problems we have identified in our functional assessment. In the following sections, we will discuss a number of effective and evidence-based strategies that teachers have found useful in addressing disruptive behavior. It would be impossible in the time we have to catalog all of the effective interventions that could be brought to bear on a problem of classroom disruption. Therefore, at the end of this module, you will find a list of helpful websites, such as Intervention Central, where you can find additional practical, helpful, and evidence-based interventions, strategies, and programs for addressing disruptive behavior. The most important rule in picking our intervention strategy, whatever it will be, is to match the intervention to the hypothesis you have derived from your FBA. Researchers have found that interventions based on a functional assessment have a higher likelihood of being effective than those that we simply choose because we just think it may work. Our FBA is our GPS for getting where we want to go in terms of changing student behavior. Without that guide, we have a much lower chance of success. The following sections illustrate some effective intervention strategies, particularly matched to certain setting events, functions, or skill deficits. First, it is possible to create change in behavior by modifying the events or situations that seem to cause the behavior to happen. One possibility is to change the task. In one case, a local school asked us to help with a second-grade boy who would routinely stop his work, slouch at his desk, and eventually slide from his chair and lay on the floor. Attempts to get him back into his seat led to major power struggles, during which the boy would physically resist any attempt to return him to his seat. A careful functional assessment showed that the boy absolutely hated writing, and that all of these events occurred when a request was made of him that involved writing. So, we broke the instructions down into smaller steps to make sure the boy understood each one. Then, we broke each step down into smaller subtasks. Whenever this student received a writing task, it would be reorganized into a series of smaller tasks or sentences and the teacher would reward the child for putting even a few words on paper. Finally, the teacher encouraged the student to write about things that interested him. In this case, motocross racing. While the writing deficits that first motivated the child's inappropriate behavior still remained, this combination allowed the boy to stay engaged in the lesson. Within weeks, there were no more episodes of lying on the floor. Second, it may be possible to affect behavior by changing the physical arrangements of a classroom. A student engaging in disruptive behavior distracts attention away from the teacher and other students, so it can be tempting to isolate the disruptive student from the rest of the class. Yet, we also know that teacher proximity can have a positive effect on student behavior. Most students' behavior improves as the teacher gets closer. Thus, even though removing a disruptive student's desk to the outskirts of the classroom arrangement may reduce distractions, this move also isolates the student from the positive effects and control that can be exercised by proximity to the teacher or other students. By keeping difficult students closest to the teacher, we can watch their behavior more closely and intervene earlier in a sequence of behavior before it becomes more serious. When we understand that a behavior occurs because of certain setting events in the classroom, we have a number of options for changing those events or situations. When the behavior is driven by external events that happen outside of school, our options seem more limited. We will discuss those in more detail later. But one intervention that many teachers find highly effective in such situations is called behavioral momentum. Behavioral momentum refers to the well-documented fact that behavior, like physical motion, tends to go in the same direction once it gets started. We sometimes call it a bad attitude, and we've all observed how bad attitudes in ourselves and others can lead to increasingly negative behaviors. One of the more common observations made by teachers of disruptive students is that there are days that they come to school with a chip on their shoulder. On those days, it seems like only a matter of time until that chip causes children to get in trouble. The point of behavioral momentum is to replace children's current negative momentum with more positive momentum. This involves starting students with much easier tasks that they are more likely to complete when they become frustrated. For example, William has woken up late, missed the bus, and been driven to school by a parent screaming at him the whole way. We might expect that William may explode if the teacher places a math worksheet that he typically has trouble with in front of him right away. Using behavioral momentum means that the teacher will start William out with things he knows won't be a problem. Erasing the board, running an errand to the teacher next door, or taking a stack of papers and putting them away in a closet. With each task, the teacher thanks William for doing such good work and provides positive feedback. Usually, by the time those tasks are done, and the student has been praised a number of times in succession for being so helpful, he will have forgotten about his terrible trip to school. Through this process, the teacher has created a shift in behavioral momentum, creating what has been called a momentum of. As we have learned, disruptive behavior can also be caused by certain functions or needs of students. In this section, we discuss some interventions that we can match to each of these functions: attention, escape, avoidance, power, control, and acceptance, affirmation. One of the more difficult problems for teachers is dealing with unmotivated learners. For example, students who have no interest in anything we put in front of them. Many teachers refer to this problem with words like, "I know he can do the work, he just won't." It seems that there is nothing that interests or motivates the student in school. Yet, it is very likely that the student has a number of interests outside of school. The parents might tell you that he's enthusiastic about basketball or can tell you anything about how computers work. These interests and enthusiasms can work to our advantage. If we learn what gets the student interested and excited, we can use those as reinforcers for completing schoolwork. We can develop a whole menu of possible reinforcers by administering a reinforcer survey to the student we are working with. This is the reinforcer survey for a 4th grade student named Mark, who completed virtually no work in the classroom. As a result, he was falling farther and farther behind. As can be noted, the survey was fairly comprehensive, asking Mark about what he liked in a variety of areas. The teacher may or may not wish to include a section on tangible rewards. This is a matter of personal preference. But with or without that section, the survey provides information on what this child likes and what might get him or her motivated. Another motivational tool is the mystery motivator. The teacher creates a daily chart that has some days marked with an invisible M. If the student achieves the behavioral goals for the day, he or she has the opportunity to see whether it is one of the special days marked with an invisible M. If so, the student receives an agreed-upon reward for that day. Knowing that Friday will be an M day, the student will work hard on that day. Whereas if he or she knows that Friday will not be an M day, the motivator is gone. Not knowing whether today will be a special day makes the process of receiving a reward more engaging. If the student achieves the behavioral goals on a day without the special M, then the child is verbally congratulated for having a good day and encouraged to work as hard tomorrow when there might be an invisible M on the chart. Reinforcement systems such as the mystery motivator may be used with either individuals or groups. Group contingencies can have a powerful effect on the total class, with everyone feeling responsible to each other to achieve specified goals. The good behavior game is an example of a group contingency system. Typically, the class is divided into 2 teams that compete to attain the least points. Points are awarded when a member of a team misbehaves. So, if someone gets out of her seat, yells out, or is engaged in a behavior that distracts others in the class, that team member's team is awarded a point. At InterventionCentral.com, Jim Wright notes that content instruction and independent seat work are appropriate times for the good behavior game. He warns that 1 to 2 hours a day are reasonable and that students need time when they can socialize and be kids. More specific insights into how to set up the game are included on the website below. One of the questions that inevitably arises in discussing the use of reinforcement strategies is whether it is really appropriate to reinforce or reward students for behaviors they should already be doing. The majority of students seem to learn appropriate classroom behaviors without strong external rewards. But those typical classroom structures that work well for most students are often not sufficient to get the attention of students who engage in disruptive behavior. It may be that a student has found that disruption is more rewarding than struggling with schoolwork that he never understood. For such students, external reinforcement is a short-term solution that can motivate disruptive students to pay better attention to more positive and adaptive alternatives, and to learn that they can receive rewards for behaving appropriately. As a student who has never succeeded in the classroom with his peers or with his schoolwork learns that there can be a connection between such positive behaviors and some type of reinforcer, it is likely that the positive behavior will occur more often. That puts the formally disruptive student in the position of being able to receive natural rewards for positive behavior, like good grades or more friendships. In fact, our goal over time is to fade out our external rewards and try to replace them with self-motivation, self-management, and the rewards that come naturally in response to improved behavior. In the short term, however, external rewards serve as an important bridge or scaffold that helps students transition from disruptive behavior to behavior that is responsive to the rules and expectations of our classroom. Many times, the problems we face with our students are comprised of several problems, at least some of which seem deeply rooted and resistant to change. In such a case, we may need a more comprehensive approach involving a long-term effort on the part of the teacher, child, and parent. One such approach is called behavioral contracting. The behavioral contract is designed to get everyone on the same page. It is a written description of desired behaviors, as well as inappropriate behaviors, and what happens in the way of rewards and negative consequences. The contract also lists who is responsible for what and includes associated timelines. Ideally, the contract is not something imposed on the student, but rather includes input from the student into clear contingencies. Similar to careful evaluation of a legal contract, it is valuable to review the provisions prior to all concerned parties signing and dating the contract. The critical stakeholders include the teacher or teachers, the student, and the parents' guardians. Again, part of the value is getting everyone on the same page. The second function of disruptive behavior is that of escape. This kind of disruptive behavior is not intended to get anything in particular, but its goal is to avoid a situation. Although there may be a number of reasons for wanting to escape, such as evading social situations, in most cases, the escape function in the classroom is based on a desire to get out of schoolwork that students believe they cannot accomplish. This poses a difficult dilemma in the classroom. Obviously, if a teacher lowers her demands, she will reduce the student's need to escape. And indeed, some teachers find their own behavior gradually shaped into giving a disruptive student less and less work because it reduces the chance of a major classroom blowout. Such an approach is ultimately harmful, however. In the short term, it places control in the hands of the student, not the teacher, and may lead to increases in the student's negative behavior. In the long term, it fails to teach the student the skills she needs to succeed in school. There are alternatives, however, that involve working with and understanding the student's need to escape, while gradually increasing demands and expectations, and teaching the student how to meet those demands. First, a teacher can provide students with a more appropriate way to take a break. Rather than providing a single acceptable activity, the teacher may provide several alternate activities. For example, reading, a worksheet, an academic puzzle, and allow the students to switch among those if they need a break from the main assignment. Under the strategy of successive approximations, we might also allow students to raise their hands and request a break. Yes, it could be argued that it is not ideal to allow students to take breaks whenever they please, but such a strategy can be a first step toward appropriate behavior and away from the disruptive methods that students might otherwise use to indicate they need a break. When using this strategy, it is important that A, the teacher defines the appropriate way of asking for breaks beforehand, and that the teacher grants breaks only for appropriate requests. B, breaks are short in duration, and C, the student does not manipulate the program through overuse or engagement in inappropriate behavior during the short break. Another promising strategy for dealing with escape behavior is to break the work down into smaller segments. It is important to remember that many students who exhibit challenging behavior also have expressive or receptive language problems. So, it makes sense to examine whether the student fully understands the directions. Perhaps the directions need to be broken down into smaller chunks or explained more frequently. The work itself can also be broken down into smaller chunks, and the student can be encouraged to check in with the teacher more frequently. For example, every 5 problems rather than every page. Finally, some students simply need a higher frequency of reward. In many classrooms, completing all of one's work during the week will lead to a reward on Friday, such as a free period or a pizza party. But for challenging students, such a reward seems eons away. They may blow their chances on Monday and, with nothing left to lose, have no motivation to work for the rest of the week. That is, if the period without reinforcement is too long. For example, if we had to wait a year for a paycheck, most of us would simply stop responding. But experimental psychologists have also found that by increasing the frequency of reinforcement, it is possible to avoid this sense of hopelessness. For students who have no hope of getting large rewards over a long period of time, it may be important to provide smaller reinforcers on a more frequent basis, like at the end of each day or at the end of a morning or afternoon. Together, the students and teacher can rate how the students perform during that time. If they agree that the students worked hard, some small reward like a sticker or 5 minutes of free time can be provided. This series of small rewards can keep the students on track toward completion of larger goals. Finally, remember to use the students' own interests to motivate them. Pair what they dread with what they enjoy in order to make schoolwork more desirable. Make assignments related to their favorite hobby or activity. Have a skateboarder write about why I like skateboarding, and use that favorite activity as a reinforcer by allowing students to read an article about skateboarding after they complete their assignment. The idea of reinforcing less desired activities with more desired activities is known as the Premack principle, or Grandma's rule. First you work, then you play. Another function that may be identified from a functional behavior assessment is that the student needs power or control. Sometimes severe outbursts that get the attention of the entire class are better seen as an attempt to gain some control rather than simply a need to attract attention. These outbursts may seem more serious, but there are methods that can be used to address issues of power and control. First, students who are disruptive or aggressive are sometimes seen as leaders among their peers. Negative leaders to be sure, but leaders nonetheless. For these students, a teacher can provide positive leadership experiences. In some peer mediation programs, selected at-risk students can be trained as mediators in order to become more positive leaders. In one classroom we worked with, a student suspected of bullying worked with the teacher and an aide to design a lesson for his class on bullying, what it was, and what you should do if you witness it. His bullying decreased dramatically as he took on the role of a positive rather than a negative leader. Researchers and teachers have also found that it is possible to address issues of power and control through choice-making. Rather than simply giving students their assignment, they allow students to choose an assignment to complete out of several alternatives. This strategy has been found to be highly successful among students with emotional and behavioral disorders. Researchers have found that when students choose their reading assignments, their disruptive behavior decreases and their work increases, even when compared to teachers providing them the exact same set of assignments. The third category of FBA hypotheses for disruptive behavior includes the skill deficits students may bring with them. A student may have poor academic or social skills that may be due to conditions like autism spectrum disorder or attention deficit disorder. Or, teachers may recognize that students dealing with challenging home environments may have a difficult time regulating their emotions or behavior. It is important to understand that while we may not be able to change students' poor skills in the short term, there are things we can do to increase students' abilities to adapt to our classroom rules and expectations. This comes by being aware of associated variables and contexts. One way to do that is through understanding the idea of establishing operations. Establishing operations are events or situations that increase or decrease the effectiveness of a reinforcer. That is, how a reinforcer might be experienced by a student. For instance, if a child has not eaten for a long period of time, food will be a highly effective motivator. We can ask ourselves how any pre-existing condition, from poor academic skills to a poor attention span to a difficult home environment, affects a student's relationship to the rewards and consequences of our classroom, and hence address these issues as establishing operations. That is, if what a student brings with them makes our rules, expectations, and classroom reward structure less effective for that student, we have to find a way to help that student learn those skills. For example, a student who is constantly harassing or being harassed by other students due to poor social skills may need some kind of social skills training. For students from home situations with little communication between home and school, formal notes sent back and forth each day and signed by the teacher and parents may help parents, teachers, and students come to shared agreements concerning classroom expectations. Finally, short or long-term counseling may be valuable for students engaging in serious disruption in order to help them better understand the connections between their attitudes and perspectives and their maladaptive behavior. What do we do when the situation seems more serious? What about a student who is constantly challenging authority or refusing to comply with any request, perhaps in an aggressive fashion? Or a situation in which there seems to be no alternative but to remove the child from the classroom. It is important to understand that teachers cannot be expected to handle the most complex and serious problems of disruptive behavior by themselves. In this section, we will describe some possible avenues and strategies when problems are escalating and seem more serious. It is important not to allow oneself to be drawn into a power struggle with a student who is constantly challenging teacher authority through noncompliance. Precision commands are a way of planning one's responses to even the most non-compliant student behavior. History often predicts the future. In advance, you can predict that certain situations will increase the likelihood of certain problem behaviors occurring. Thus, in advance, you may plan exactly what you will say using a procedure called precision request or precision commands. Here is an example of a planned set of precision commands. Danny, please bring me the whiteboard marker. Notice that it is said with a polite tone of voice and that it is clear in terms of what Danny is expected to do. In the event that Danny doesn't comply after 3 to 5 seconds, the second command would be, Danny, you need to bring me the whiteboard marker right now. The tone is firm and lacks any hint of anger. If he again fails to comply, the third statement indicates the consequence for Danny's lack of action. Danny, you've lost 5 minutes of free time. Finally, the second command would be restated. Danny, you need to bring me the whiteboard marker right now. The volume and tone of voice would be the same as the first command. This is in contrast to our natural tendency to say it louder and with more emphasis. Again, firm, polite, and clear. To be most effective, it is important to remember that a precision command or request is not rude, but rather a polite way of directing or redirecting a student. To be most effective, a precision command describes in unambiguous terms what is expected. Open your math book to page 54 is better than open to where we left off yesterday. When delivering instructions to the student, the closer you are to the student, the better. 3 feet away from the student is vastly preferable to calling out commands from the front of the room. The delivery of the command should be matter-of-fact, as opposed to angry or emotional. Another enhancement to the delivery is looking directly at the student and making eye contact. A precision command is not presented in the form of a question. If the student could say yes or no, it is not a command. Despite our best efforts, there are times when students will need to be removed from the classroom for issues of their own or others' safety. As noted in the previous module on classroom behavior management, this does not mean that we should rely on suspension and expulsion. The more we come to understand the data, the more it appears that disciplinary approaches such as zero tolerance that over-rely on suspension and expulsion are not effective in changing student behavior or improving school safety. In addition, out-of-school suspension and expulsion remove students from what is our primary goal in schooling, being present for instruction, and increase the likelihood that disruptive students will only fall farther behind and become more disengaged. Thus, many schools are beginning to consider in-school alternatives when students need to be removed from the class. In order to be effective, in-school suspension programs should have well-trained staff, a strong academic focus, a clear set of rules that are strictly enforced, and the ability to teach students new behavior while they are in that setting. For example, some in-school programs include a problem-solving routine where the teacher or aide processes the behavioral referral with the students when they arrive. What did the student do? What could he have done differently? What will he try to do next time? It is very important to understand that a classroom teacher cannot address all issues of disruptive behavior alone. Other professionals, both within and outside the school, can be called upon to help solve problems of challenging behavior in the classroom. Your school psychologist is highly trained in functional behavior assessment and the design and implementation of behavioral interventions. Other school professionals, such as school social workers, counselors, or administrators, should also be involved as needed. If the student is in special education, the case conference or treatment team should be involved to increase resources available to you as a teacher and decide on next steps. Finally, many schools and communities are realizing that students who engage in disruptive behavior in schools may also be involved in other social systems outside of school, such as mental health, social services, or probation. In recent years, social service agencies have worked collaboratively to more effectively address serious and complex problems of children, youth, and their families. If you believe a student's problems are bigger than simply what you see in school, seek out such resources to get the help you need. Once we understand the behavior and have found strategies that seem promising for addressing the needs identified in our functional behavior assessment, it is time to weave those together into a comprehensive instructional plan. As noted previously, when we face problems of disruptive behavior, it is very important to have a set of planned responses so that we do not become emotional, reactive, or drawn into fruitless power struggles. At a minimum, A behavior plan must specify for both the student and the behavior the precise responses a student will receive if he engages in the targeted behavior. This plan, developed by the University of Kansas Circle of Inclusion Project, describes a set of responses to biting behavior. Notice that the plan describes the specific behavior, the intervention, and consequences associated with student responses, and the criteria for knowing when the plan has succeeded. Such a plan helps guarantee that those working with the student react consistently from event to event and across staff. But while specifying how we should respond when a child acts out is necessary to ensure consistency, it is important to recognize that it is not sufficient without teaching new, appropriate behaviors. In order to ensure reliable, long-lasting behavioral change, we must simultaneously engage in two sets of activities that must be reflected in our comprehensive behavior plan. First, our interventions are obviously directed toward reducing the frequency of the disruptive behavior, both for the sake of other students and to improve the life of the student who is engaging in those behaviors. But simply reducing or eliminating negative behaviors does not teach a student the new behaviors he or she needs to be successful in a classroom, a school, or in life. Thus, comprehensive intervention plans must also focus on teaching students new, more adaptive behaviors that enable them to succeed better in interacting in the classroom and with other students. The fourth phase of the functional assessment is designing an individual behavior plan. This plan must include, but is in no way limited to, a definition of responses to or consequences for disruptive behavior. We must also consider the instructional strategies we will use to teach the replacement behavior or behaviors we have decided upon. Since we must focus on teaching new, more positive behaviors, let's review the basic elements of quality instruction. First, it is essential to have instructional clarity so that students have a clear understanding of what is expected. Students need to be oriented and be ready to begin the task. This means having all the necessary tools, paper, pencil, book, etc. Next, the teacher presents new material in the context of previous material. For example, a brief review of work done during previous lessons. Or, stated another way, the teacher reminds the students what they already know to reinforce that knowledge and provide anchors for new material. Third, teachers provide students many opportunities to learn. Research in the 1970s highlighted the importance of giving students time and frequent opportunities to learn. That is, if a student fails to learn the material the first time, we try again until they master the material. Next, we monitor students' work to see how well the instruction hit the target and provide frequent feedback and correction or reteaching to gradually shape students' performance. Finally, we conduct frequent learning probes to make sure that students are learning what we are trying to teach. Learning probes may be questions asked to the class, quizzes, or homework assignments. A probe usually asks for a brief student response, the purpose being to determine the degree to which students comprehend the lesson content. We can use these same steps of effective instruction in designing a plan to teach students new behavior as part of the behavior plan. This is the instructional plan form that is part of the Indiana University Institute for Child Study Functional Assessment procedure. Once the replacement behavior to be taught is defined, row 1, the behavior plan leads through 5 phases of teaching any new material or behavior. First, we define how we will teach the new behavior and determine how we will orient it to the lesson through pre-teaching activities. Will we use individual discussion with the student? Or might other students benefit as well from a whole class discussion? Are there physical cues, such as hand signs, or brief verbal cues that the teacher can use to orient the student to the behavior and remind him of the intervention program? Second, we teach the behavior through direct instruction. How often and in what ways will we instruct the student? Research has shown that including physical components, such as role play or demonstration, greatly increases the effectiveness of instruction, especially when we are trying to teach a new behavior. Observation and monitoring are also powerful tools for teaching. The target student should have opportunities to observe appropriate behavior and see how such behavior is rewarded. To increase a student's opportunity to learn, we provide the student with abundant chances for reinforced practice. How can we ensure that the student has many opportunities to be rewarded for demonstrating the appropriate replacement behavior in the class? Will we also provide opportunities outside of class, such as social skills training, for the student to demonstrate his mastery of the new behavior? How will we reinforce instances of the new behavior we are trying to teach, both to draw the student's attention to that behavior and to help her see that positive behavior leads to positive outcomes in this class? Finally, since the goal of any instructional program is not to have students rely on outside interventions, but to become capable of managing their own behavior, we plan right from the beginning a set of self-management strategies for gradually moving from externally based control to self-control. In this section, we have described a number of interventions and strategies for addressing disruptive behavior. A reasonable question to ask at this point might be, in a particular situation with a particularly difficult child, what would be the one best thing to do? For truly serious and complex cases of disruptive behavior, the best thing to do is to implement a number of effective interventions simultaneously. The first author, along with a school psychologist in training, worked with a teacher at Oakview Elementary School to address the problems faced by a fourth grader named Casey. Note that both the name of the student and school have been changed. Casey's teacher referred him to us because of very severe crying and temper tantrums. He would weep uncontrollably, and sometimes these tantrums would escalate into kicking his chair or throwing objects. In the course of crying, he wiped his hands on his face and then on other things around him. This led to teasing by his classmates and raised health concerns in the classroom. The teacher and other school staff conducted a functional behavior assessment, revealing that these behaviors were predominantly an issue of escape. The crying occurred primarily during times when Casey had been assigned independent seat work. Conversations with Casey's teacher indicated that the problem was not necessarily low academic skills. When he did his work, he often got 80 to 90% correct. Rather, Casey's problem appeared to be one of anxiety. He was extremely afraid that he would get answers wrong. Together, these issues had reached a crisis stage in the classroom, both for Casey and for the classroom teacher, whose instruction was completely disrupted by these incidents as often as once a day. In order to address these multiple and complex issues, the team designed an intervention consisting of a number of components. First, Casey worked with the graduate school psychology student to develop a list of coping mechanisms that could serve as replacement behaviors for his crying, under the title, "When I am upset, I will." These were behaviors such as, "I will request a break," or "I will raise my hand and tell the teacher I am nervous about this assignment." This list was posted on his desk as a sort of menu, and when he chose to use one of those strategies instead of crying, the teacher praised him for using that strategy, and he was allowed a 4-minute cool-down period. The teacher also used a procedure based on behavioral momentum. Some easier worksheets were placed in Casey's desk, and he was allowed to work on those when he felt upset until he felt calm enough to return to his regular assignment. The teacher also explained the health and safety issues involved in rubbing his nose while he was crying, and a self-monitoring intervention was developed to encourage the use of tissues placed on his desk whenever he cried. Over the course of the fall semester, Casey learned how to use his alternate coping mechanisms. As a result of these interventions, his tantrums, including kicking and throwing things, were under control by the end of the semester, and his crying episodes were less frequent and much less severe. Casey was still by no means a model student. He continued to have problems of severe off-task behavior and interacting with other students that required monitoring and further intervention. But the teacher's willingness to implement and persevere with a multi-component intervention moved this problem from an absolute crisis into something that was much more manageable for all involved. The final step in developing effective interventions is to see whether our interventions had the desired effect and to evaluate and tweak our programs when necessary to make them more effective. Collecting data on behavior may seem a foreign concept to many teachers, but there are many reasons to collect data to evaluate how we did. The most obvious is the parallel to teaching academic subjects. Would anyone teach a subject without in some way assessing student performance? In academic subjects, we have unit tests, midterms, final examinations, and state accountability tests, all of which are designed to provide feedback on how the student is progressing on what we are teaching. Just as failing to monitor student progress in response to our instruction might lead us to continue using ineffective instructional techniques, failing to monitor improvement or lack of improvement in student behavior may lead us to continue using ineffective behavioral interventions. Just as importantly, failing to monitor student behavioral data may cause us not to notice actual student progress. We have often worked with staff who argue that the student they are intervening with is not improving, when in fact, the data show that the student has made great progress. Disruptive behavior creates emotional reactions in all of us. It may be difficult to let go of negative feelings about a student or to trust that student even after the student's behavior has begun to improve. Charting and graphing behavior shows us that yes, Johnny is slowly but surely getting better. Finally, students with challenging behaviors are like onions. As we peel away one level of disruption, kicking chairs to avoid doing work, and get that behavior under control, we may be frustrated by the fact that there are other behaviors we hadn't seen or hadn't noticed, such as serious off-task behavior. We may feel a great deal of frustration that the process seems never ending. Seeing data that show us that there has been improvement in behaviors that were initially our most serious concern may provide hope and reassurance that things can improve and indeed are improving. Here is an illustration of a homework intervention that was quite effective. Teachers collected baseline data for the first 4 weeks. During the baseline phase, the student turned in no more than 35% of the assignments during each week. In the 3rd week, he only turned in 1 out of 10 assignments. As can be seen on the graph, the homework behavior of the student changed dramatically in the 5th week when the teacher, student, and parents established a home-school contract. In a time when accountability is the buzzword in education, this graphic demonstration of effectiveness is very important. We can use charts such as this to demonstrate to parents, administrators, and even school board members that our programs are having a positive effect and deserve to be supported. At the beginning of this module, we asked, what would you do if a kid throws a chair? Duck is not a bad answer, but after reviewing all of the material in this module, we emphasize that a better response would be to teach disruptive students how to stay in their chairs in the first place. We accentuate the positive to teach students new, more positive behaviors. We use the results of functional behavioral assessment, or FBAs, to gain an understanding of what is causing the student to behave in this way. Once we better understand the behavior, we seek out and implement effective strategies that can address the functions, setting events, or skill deficits we identified in our FBA. We weave those strategies together into a comprehensive behavior plan with the goals of decreasing negative behavior and teaching the disruptive student replacement behaviors that will enable him or her to be more successful in school and in life. And finally, we assess and evaluate our efforts and, where necessary, start over or tweak our intervention plans to make them more effective. There is no question that disruptive behavior constitutes one of the more serious challenges faced by any classroom teacher. If we are to ensure that our classrooms are productive environments, not characterized by constant interruption, but instead by both academic and social learning, we as teachers must find effective methods for addressing disruptive behavior. Armed with a framework for understanding challenging behavior, a repertoire of proven effective strategies, and the support of other educational professionals, it is possible to keep disruptive behavior from overwhelming our classrooms. Sometimes in that process, we may even find that our efforts are much more successful than we had hoped, and a child's life may be turned around. And that is why we teach. Here are a set of websites that include a wide variety of behavioral interventions for disruptive behavior that you can use to find more alternatives and options for your classroom. We urge you to explore these resources thoroughly and to increase the chances that these strategies will work in your classroom as part of a larger framework of functional behavioral assessment.